Garbage in, garbage out. That's how comedian George Carlin once described American politics, arguing, maybe sincerely, maybe facetiously, who knows, that politicians don't fall from the sky, but are the products of American society, selected by American voters. I suppose this is a version of people get the government they deserve, but Carlin would then go in another direction, making it a speech about not voting at all. The bit ends with him saying that voting is essentially the same thing as masturbating. The only difference, he'd tell the audience, is that when I get finished masturbating, I'm going to have a little something to show for it, folks. Carlin's routine is about the futility of voting, a sensation that I think most people have experienced at some point in life. That goes double for elections in Russia, which is a phenomenon that many foreigners are surprised to learn even exists in the Putin regime. I just use the word elections, but voting is perhaps the better, more honest term here. As I speak, regional voting is underway in areas across Russia, in addition to 4 occupied regions of Ukraine that Russia annexed a year ago. So let's talk about this weekend's Russian elections and about election monitoring, and try to figure out if they're any more meaningful than George Carlin at home, all alone on a Tuesday. Welcome to the Naked Pravda. Howdy folks, welcome to the Naked Pravda. I'm your host, Kevin Rothrock, the managing editor of Medusa's English language edition. On this week's episode of the podcast, we'll tackle Russia's 2023 regional elections, which will mostly occur on Sunday, September 10th, though it's a 3-day affair in many regions, and voting actually began on Friday, September 8th, which is when I'm recording these words. We're talking 26 gubernatorial elections, 20 regional parliamentary contests, and a whole mess of municipal and local races. Occupying forces in 4 regions of Ukraine are staging votes too. But what does any of this mean? If you're new to the very concept of elections or voting in Russia, what should you make of this weekend? That is a question I put to Andras Totsifra, a fellow with the Eurasia program of the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Philadelphia. For just somebody who's tuning in to this episode because they saw a headline and realize that Russia is having elections right now and has elections at all, what would you want them to take away if they had like just a few minutes to pay attention to this, the sort of like elevator speech for what's happening this weekend in terms of these elections?
So what I would tell anyone who is not intimately familiar with elections in Russia is that if you regard elections as we should be regarding elections, honestly, in a democracy, which is people freely choosing their representatives who then design and implement various policies, then you can hardly call these elections. For 2 reasons. First of all, a relentless centralization of powers to the federal center from the regions, which makes it very difficult to design and implement policies in the regions that are independent from the Kremlin's will, but also because of the growing repression that Russia's domestic politics has experienced over the past, I would say, 2.5 years, but perhaps especially since the beginning of the full-scale invasion. However, if you regard elections as means of political signaling, in both directions really, from voters to government, from government to voters and elites, then these elections are important and are interesting to look at because they reflect the risks that the Kremlin faces domestically after 1.5 years of full-scale war against Ukraine.
In terms of like all the elections, included from the Russian Far East to the occupied regions of Ukraine, is there kind of like a single approach to the voting process, or is it like wildly different?
Regions have vastly different political traditions. The openness of the politics is different across the country. There, you will have regions in Russia where elections are freer, much freer than in others, where campaigning is more open, there's a more pluralistic politics is taking place. But I could also mention some regions in the northwest of Russia where politics has been even in the past years, more pluralistic than, say, in North Caucasian republics, which are called electoral sultanates in Russian political parlance for a reason. It's because they always turn out, close or over 80% turnout and votes for United Russia, which is down to the the very specific way politics is conducted in these republics, down to their political history, how local autocracies were built in these regions earlier than autocracy as we know it today was built in Russia as a whole. And then you will have regions that are in between, that are not particularly pluralistic by Russian standards, but I wouldn't classify them as completely closed either. So specifically, these elections that are taking place this week, we see more sort of problematic from the point of view of the authorities regions than in last year's elections. So that's one circumstance that makes the elections more interesting to watch. And then to say something about the elections in the occupied territories, of course, that's a completely different category, I would say, because first of all, observers have very little, if any, access to them. And it is very difficult to verify how voting will take place. We'll have to rely on certain reports, eyewitness reports that are going to be published in social media or in some independent media outlets that get these reports. They are held under war conditions, which was not even possible under Russian law until amendment to electoral legislation earlier this year, in which it is odd still that these elections are even taking place, given that in two border districts of the Belgorod region in Russia that have experienced shelling, the elections are going to be postponed because of the dangers that these border districts ostensibly face.
So they're suspending elections in border territories, but they're holding them in occupied territories?
That is correct. I mean, they're suspending elections in those two districts, not all border territories, but yes. I think this tells you that the purpose of these elections is pretty much the same as the so-called referenda that were organized in the same territories last year, which themselves were held to underline that in spite of a Ukrainian counteroffensive, which, if you remember, then was going on and was fairly successful, these regions were very firmly under Russia's control, and Russia could carry out its will in these regions. And I see the elections that are happening, that are going to be held, or the votes that are going to be held, however you want to call them, in these 4 occupied territories this week as a similar show of force that is meant to show to Ukraine and to the world that Russia is controlling these territories and is able to carry out its will and is willing to integrate them into Russia. But of course, it doesn't mean that there are no candidates. There are various Russian parties that all supported various candidates, some of whom are local officials, some of whom are local sort of citizens fulfilling various roles. But I'm not even saying that we should take the results with a pinch of salt. I think these results are not going to be indicative of anything that happened out on the ground. They are very likely to be, they're going to be very difficult to be taken seriously in any way, other than what I have mentioned, this sort of show of force.
What can you tell me about the elections in Khakassia? I've read that they're being described as kind of the most, or maybe even the only, possibly competitive, or they maybe were going to be, but it's maybe no longer the case. Like, have you been tracking this? What's the situation with these elections?
So to understand the significance of the elections in Khakassia, we have to briefly go back to 2018, when in comparatively much more competitive domestic political circumstances than now, the Kremlin faced 4 surprising electoral upsets in that year's gubernatorial elections. And the most famous one, of course, was Sergei Furgal in the Khabarovsk region, who has since been arrested and convicted, famously prompting a series of protests in the region. But in the other 3 regions, the Kremlin tried to sort of annul or in any other way invalidate these results. And in one region, the maritime territory, the election was actually invalidated, and new elections were held with new candidates. In the Vladimir region, in European Russia, the newly elected governor, Liberal Democrat Sipyagin, was allowed to take office, but then after the 2021 Duma election, he was offered a seat in the Duma, which he took. So the Kremlin could appoint a united Russia governor in his stead. And Khakassia is the only region of the 4 where the communist governor who was elected in 2018, Valentin Konovalov, could not only take his office, but also remain in office throughout the term. And that makes the position of this otherwise very small, we're talking about a couple of hundreds of thousands of voters, otherwise it's very small and relatively poor region in Siberia, very interesting. what happened was that the Kremlin, instead of simply dismissing Konovalov, which the president could do under new legislation adopted in 2021, basically simply by stating that Konovalov lost his confidence, or lost his support, lost his trust. Instead of doing that, the Kremlin decided to run Sergei Sokol, a Duma deputy who briefly participated in the war, against him. And this made the campaign interesting because what happened was that Sokol tried to kind of play up his veteran credentials, which didn't work out very well for him, according to the very scarce public opinion surveys that we have access to from the region. While Konovalov tried to sort of rally local elites around himself, and he portrayed Sokol as an outsider, which is a very historically been an effective means of campaigning, portraying these sort of governors, so-called Varangian governors, whom the Kremlin sometimes sends to, very often sends to regions to oversee the regions without having links to the territories that they are governing. The campaign itself was very eventful, and it was full of, let's say, unorthodox means of campaigning, including live pigs emblazoned with the emblems of Konovalov's Communist Party, for instance, or the governor.
Is that bad? The pigs are bad, I take.
Yes, it was a negative. It was a sort of chorny PR, as they call it. And you had the usual struggle over the so-called spoiler candidates. Spoiler candidates are the kind of candidates that run with either the suspected or open support of the authorities against, in order to split opposition votes. There was the story of Konovalov sort of enlisting one of the main former United Russia personalities in the region, the speaker of the regional parliament, and there was a series of debates. And after these debates, after surveys reportedly still thought that there might be a second round, or even that Konovalov might win in the first round, so it was uncomfortably close. Sokol withdrew his candidacy last week, ostensibly because he was hospitalized with peritonitis. And I'm not going to say that this definitely happened on behest of the authorities or the Kremlin, but we need to note that Sokol had struggled with this illness in the campaign before, and yet he chose this very late moment to withdraw his candidacy, which of course prompted speculations. And I think a very interesting takeaway from what then happened was that even though there was a scenario in which the elections themselves could have been called off if the other two kind of candidates who are running against Konovalov, if they had withdrawn, then the elections could have been postponed by up to 3 months. And Konovalov's mandate runs out in November. So technically, he could have been simply replaced with someone, and new elections could have been held in December. But this didn't happen. And what happened instead is that now the Liberal Democrat candidate is portraying himself as the main opposition. And I think from the Kremlin's point of view, if we accept the explanation that they either tacitly or openly or actively approved Sokol's withdrawal, then this is to me a sign that they did not want to even allow the remote possibility that this election could become a kind of referendum on a war veteran and on the topic of a war veteran in an electoral campaign. Instead, they withdrew Sokol and let a much more safer person, the Liberal Democratic candidate, battled it out with him, hoping that Sokol's voters will now be voting for the Liberal Democratic candidate, maybe, or focusing on the region's legislative elections, which are also going to be held or are held this week, and perhaps trying to build up a blocking majority against the governor. However, the two reasons why the elections were interesting to me were, even with the withdrawal of Sokol, is first that we have seen a genuinely competitive election in Russia in 2023, which itself is notable, and also because it showcased potentially showcased how brittle this sort of very rigid political system of political control is over Russia's domestic politics that the Kremlin seems to aspire to.
Do you think that these like little pockets of semi or relatively more free and fair elections or more competitive elections, is that something that exists by design so that the Kremlin can essentially experiment with attitudes and sort of judge candidates and parties and so on? Or is it just that Russia's a big country and as authoritarian as the regime is, it just can't control everything?
So first of all, yes, authoritarianism, even when it is hardening as it does in Russia, obviously such a vast country will leave pockets that cannot be supervised closely enough to guarantee full control for the central government. And it's not for a lack of trying, because over the past 2 or 3 years, the Kremlin has adopted a range of both policies and laws that, for instance, the 2021 public administration reform, or the sort of the digitalization of a lot of aspects of the of regional governance on the level of the federal government, that were meant to sort of reduce the risks of grassroots political competition or genuine political competition emerging in the regions. And in the case of gubernatorial elections, as we see, they have been fairly successful. So right now, most of the political intrigue that we have seen over the past year, that we see now, happens more or less on the level of cities or even lower levels around local issues. And I think that's certainly a result of the Kremlin's political engineering.
Okay, so staging elections in an authoritarian regime is tricky business. You've got spoiler candidates, political intrigue, and all manner of manipulations in varying degrees, types, and God knows what else. As the Kremlin's domestic policy team labors to manage Russian democracy, election observers do what they can to hold officials accountable. But what does it actually mean to monitor elections in these conditions? To find out, I spoke to Galina Selivanova, an election monitor and a social scientist from the University of Bonn. My first question for her was about the Golos movement, Russia's leading elections watchdog. So the first question I had was, what is the organization Golos? Like, when did it appear? Mm-hmm. What exactly does it do? And like, does it still do the same thing it did 10 years ago, or has its role changed? Like, what is Golos?
Well, so Golos is very similar to other election monitoring organizations that appeared in the former Soviet Union states when these countries gained independence, and relatively competitive and multi-party elections started in these countries. Simultaneously, there were a lot of organizations, civil society organizations, emerging in this more or less free environment. And one of the type of organizations emerging in FSU and former Soviet Union countries were these election monitoring organizations. So similar ones are, for example, ISFET in Georgia, Promolex in Moldova. Ukraine has two, KVO and Apora. They're slightly different, but there are two election monitoring organizations. Essentially, these are, and Golos used to be initially such an organization, professional NGO that conducted independent oversight of electoral process. These organizations usually conduct this oversight following 3 sequential periods in electoral procedures. So the pre-electoral procedures, for example, registration of candidates, nomination, registration, political agitation, these things. Then they monitor election day, so all procedures are followed on the election day, and they often monitor also the post-electoral phase, for example, whether candidates who were elected could actually assume those posts. So they are professional NGOs who usually collect expertise on elections. They collect information from domestic and international actors, and at the end of the day, they present their work through reports that are not directed at the general public. They're directed at stakeholders who participate somehow in electoral process. So now, well, we know that these organizations have the most productive work in hybrid regimes, so hybrid regimes that combine autocratic and democratic traces. And what is important is that in such regimes, there are multi-party, there are relatively competitive elections, but they cannot be labeled free and fair. So these professionalized NGOs, they work to make these elections correspond to certain international standards to label them as free and fair. Golos started as such a professionalized NGO in early 2000s, and for a very long time they worked as a professional NGO. Also, they continued working in this style, but they had to respond to pressure that was exercised by the political regime in Russia, that from hybrid regime returned, so rolled back to autocracy, gained more and more autocratic features, and generally all civil society space was kind of shrinking. And Golos was not the only organization that was oppressed, that was affected by this change in political environment. But because elections are equally crucial to democratic and autocratic regimes, Golos was sort of on a very brink, on a very spotlight in the political process in Russia, and therefore they were among the first ones to be labeled as foreign agents in Russia. They were among the first ones to get smearing campaigns against them. So Golos was always kind of the first ones to be affected by the changes in the nature of political regime in Russia.
I know that in the United States, a lot of the election monitoring is done by the people affiliated with the political parties. And obviously, that's how we got a lot of the Republicans who were unhappy with the last presidential election. Does Golos work specifically with political parties, or is this totally separate? You have political party affiliated election monitors and you have Golos, or do they intertwine at all?
Well, again, going back to history, originally, and it is the same way in many FSU states, election monitoring organizations could appoint election observers. So they can appoint observers, write complaints, participate in wider decision-making and political process in terms of changing electoral laws, suggesting amendments in electoral laws. In Russia, that was the same. Initially, election monitoring organizations could appoint observers, but this has changed, and there is general trend in Russia that the decreasing civil society space and also decreasing opportunities for election monitoring. So at some point, I can't give you the exact date, at some point there was the law on election monitoring was amended, and it's only political parties and candidates who can appoint election observers to electoral commission to observe in electoral commission or territorial electoral commission. So more or less it is the same way as in the US, but it doesn't mean that this changes, the elimination of independent election monitoring organizations from this process was necessarily a democratizing or was necessarily an improvement. Essentially,
and are there any parties or candidates who are willing to work with organizations like Golos, even to this day?
Yes, absolutely. So the point is that organizations, what they can now do is they provide an infrastructure for election monitoring for average citizens. They provide materials, they provide information, they teach them how to observe elections. They have this hotline during election day, for example, or even in the pre-electoral process when people can call and report some violations, for example, pressure on voters, such things. But these organizations, they cannot appoint observers. Therefore, they agree with different political parties to give a note to appoint these people who were educated by election monitoring organizations and send them from political parties to monitor elections in every specific precinct. And more or less, this arrangement works the same way in any city with any election monitoring organization, because Golos is not the single one, it's the biggest organization, but we certainly have more organizations that deal with election monitoring in Russia, and they all work more or less in the same way. Many of them refuse to work with United Russia, and United Russia is also not very interested in working with independent observers. But at the same time, for political parties, this is also an advantageous situation, because there is a bunch of people who already know how the electoral process works, how this the whole election day should look like. and they just go there and get a piece of paper from the political party signed that they are appointed to that or another precinct, and therefore political parties kind of show presence of many supporters and their presence on precincts, and people get an opportunity to observe the electoral process.
And does Golos still exist now? Because I know
Yes.
that it's it was first designated as a foreign agent when it used to be a formal organization more than a decade ago. It was like one of the first. And then it became like a movement. And so what exactly, do you know, is it a movement today still, or what is its like designation as an entity?
So it doesn't have a registered entity. They call themselves an association. So I would call them, as a social scientist, I call them social movement organization. There is some organizational core. They didn't lose their pool of experts, political scientists, legal scientists who worked with them before they were designated as a foreign agent. But at the same time, it is much looser, less hierarchical structure that has chapters in different cities that work according to the political context in every specific city. So indeed, Golos exists and the chapters even grow. For example, we didn't have one in St. Petersburg, but we got one recently, quite recently. So it is a very even personalized story. When there is an activist who is ready to conduct this work, and of course this is all volunteering, nobody is getting paid for this work. So everyone is sort of an activist or participant of a social movement organization. They work for free. So yeah, indeed, Golos exists, but they just changed their form to less traceable, less organized, less formalized network-like structure, which they call association, Asociacja Golos.
Right. And how significant do you think it is that last month police arrested and then jailed Golos co-chairman Georgi Melkonyans, and they raided, I think, the homes of like a dozen other people across the country in different regions. Is this, I would assume it will have some kind of chilling effect, but is this the end of Golos as we know it, or is this just the latest of like the crackdowns and members and affiliates? They just roll with the punches. Like what do you expect to come of this?
I do not think that this is an end of Golos, and Golos has 10 years of experience existing under increasing pressure in increasingly autocratic environments. So it's certainly not the end of Golos. Because it is a network, because it is an association of different chapters, the chapters adapt to local context rather than the federal pressure. A lot of Golos activists work from abroad, and given the current development of ICTs, we can certainly do lots of things and observe lots of things from abroad, given that there are activists and informants on the ground, of course. But nonetheless, this is certainly not the end of Golos. And although it is very, very sad that Grigory Melkonyans was arrested, I don't think that arresting one member, I don't want to give more more ideas to the other side, but I don't
one
think arresting one
who would you arrest? Who would you take out to really behead the organization?
No one.
Give me the strategy.
Nobody okay. Matters. That's
yeah. We'll put a pin in that. Yeah.
No one person matters. But it's not the first time when Golos representatives got arrested. I want to remind you that we had the case of Romano Dod, who maybe don't put it on the air, don't put it, but there were other members of Golos who experienced this type of persecution, this type of pressure before Grigory Melkonyans. Of course, they didn't get such a severe punishment, but nonetheless, I think that arresting Melkonyans, well, it might have some chilling effect, but not on very, very devoted and committed activists. Maybe some rank and file activists might think that they will skip this campaign or they will reconsider what kind of activities they participate in. But generally, I think that interest in election monitoring is growing in Russia and has been steadily growing over years as one of the very limited opportunities for relatively safe, relatively legal, well, it is a legal way of participating in politics and engaging with politics, getting experience of collective action. So people have a lot of interest in election monitoring, and I don't think that's going to change.
And what are some of the most common violations that Golos and other election monitors are flagging? Because I know that if you even mention the concept of Russian election monitoring or just elections to a lot of foreigners, they kind of look at you like, why does Putin even have elections? And obviously it's a whole discussion as to why the regime needs the legitimacy of elections in the first place. But just as sort of a practical question, what are the irregularities and the violations that are flagged? You've mentioned that there's sort of three processes to the monitoring. Like what are monitors flagging as oh, that's problematic right there.
I wish I had an answer to this question. I get this question a lot. And my first answer to this question is always Russia is a big country and it is a very diverse country. So electoral fraud, and electoral manipulations really very much depend on the region. I can proudly say, as Siberian myself, that in Siberia, people do not manipulate elections as much as they do in other regions, for example. So, for example, the level of electoral fraud on election day is very, very low in Siberian cities. And therefore, we can see some instances of opposition candidates winning, and they win in more or less fair elections.
Protests against fraud in Russia's 2011 parliamentary elections brought international attention to shenanigans like so-called carousel voting, ballot stuffing, and other election day irregularities. Well, this stuff still happens. The main violations are before any ballots are cast, Silivanova told me.
I think what is more important is maybe not even violations on election day. The more important type of violation is generally what we political scientists call skewed playing field. So it is uneven, the set of conditions that are not even for all candidates. This is one thing, that incumbent candidates get more opportunities to present themselves. They get bigger budgets for agitation. They get more time on air. And at the same time, this cleaning, the wiping off any opposition from the political context. So protests in 2019, for example, a lot of people protested not against electoral fraud because elections didn't happen yet. People protested against not registering candidates who wanted to run for municipal elections. We're not even talking about high-level nationwide campaign. We're talking about local municipal elections, and authorities didn't register any opposition candidates for those elections. So this skewed playing field and hand-picked candidates, so hand-picked sparring candidates for the incumbent, this is, I think, the biggest problem of Russian elections. And then the rest is just an additional kind of toolkit that helps incumbents win with more votes, getting more votes than they would get initially with this very uninteresting election during this very uninteresting election campaign.
The 2019 protests Silivanova mentions were summer demonstrations in Moscow in response to election officials refusing to register the candidacy of independent politicians in races for the city council. The city's police responded to the protests with surprising force, arresting more than 1,300 people, including several minors, on a single day in late July. City prosecutors then launched a massive investigation alleging rioting by demonstrators, and more than a dozen people were convicted in what became known as the Moscow case. I wanted to ask you one kind of last question or set of questions about basically Russians' attitudes toward voting and democracy and the concept of whether or not there is a potential or an option to sort of cast a protest vote. So this is sort of a two-parter, I guess. Mm-hmm. Like one, what is your grasp of how average people in Russia view the voting process itself? Like, is it viewed widely skeptically? Is it viewed as like, this is a patriotic duty? I mean, this is obviously a really broad generalization, and I'm sure you could, just as an American, I know that I run into people who are like, voting's for idiots versus how could you not vote? And so maybe this is a dumb question. But then the other question is maybe less dumb, like, is there such a thing as a protest vote today in Russia?
The first thing, how Russians view elections. Russians are just normal human beings and normal voters. And if a campaign is interesting, even if it's a local, super small municipal campaign, and it's interesting, competitive, and outcomes are not predetermined, then they will happily participate not only in elections, but even in campaigning for or against the candidates that are competing. So in this sense, Russian attitudes towards election changes when the campaign gets more interesting. If there are no candidates, if there is a predetermined result, why would I waste Sunday morning, Sunday, generally my only weekend maybe, in going and voting at a precinct if I know that my casting vote doesn't change anything. And I don't think this is somehow specific or different in case of Russia. So I think what is more important is that there's growing interest towards election monitoring. And I spoke to these activists who provide this infrastructure for election monitoring in St. Petersburg, for example, last year, the year when the full-scale invasion started, when nobody knew what is happening next, when oppression turned to the next level. And at the same time, lots of activists mentioned that interest in election monitoring was growing. And there were so many more newcomers, first-time observers who wanted to control elections, who wanted to participate and engage and get this experience of monitoring even very, very small, remote municipal campaigns. So I think Russians, if they get an opportunity to vote at interesting and somehow unpredictable elections, they can get very interested, they can get very engaged. They want to participate in the electoral process beyond only voting, beyond only casting a ballot sheet in the box. Certainly because the regime is getting more and more autocratic and opportunities for participation are closing down. This might translate in apathy, in absenteeism, and less interest in election campaign because people don't know why to waste time, why do that, and participate in these sham elections. A lot of people understand that elections are sham. This is more like a ritual rather than some meaningful political act. Indeed, there are some people who submit to this pressure. There is a lot of dependent electorate, so administratively dependent electorate who are guided to precincts by their bosses, by their foremen. They just say, we cannot do anything else. We just do this. This is a duty to save our job place, save our salaries, whatsoever. And the same with electoral fraud. This is why a lot of teachers commit electoral fraud and participate in this manipulation, in this electoral fraud business, because they want to save their workplace. They are not so much committed to United Russia or Putin per se. They just want to continue working in those schools or in other state-related institutions. This is probably how Russians view voting.
In essays about the social contract at the heart of the Putin regime, analysts frequently argue that the Kremlin discourages ordinary people from participating actively in politics, especially elections. The old bargain, which maybe holds less true today than before, was that Putin offers stability in exchange for loyalty. By robbing elections of competition and rendering their outcome a foregone conclusion, the Kremlin also made voting a thoroughly boring process. I asked Andras about the authorities' current work nationwide in different regions when it comes to voting. In terms of like all the elections, including from the Russian Far East to the occupied regions of Ukraine, is there kind of like a single approach to the voting process, or is it like wildly different?
The general approach to any election, but that is not a presidential election in Russia, has been to sort of depress turnout in the sense that make people uninterested in politics, depoliticize, to sort of prevent grassroots movements with a wide appeal from emerging, and at the same time make sure that the quote unquote the right people go and vote. How do you do that? Well, you provide various incentives, sometimes coercive, sometimes positive incentives. Coercive incentives include people being pressured through their companies, for instance, if they work for a state-owned company or a big enough company in a region that the authorities sort of can use as a proxy. Or if you're a public official in any way depend on the state, then the state has means to make sure that you turn out and vote and that you vote for the right party.
Last question I had was, what do you think the potential is for protest voting in these upcoming elections? I know that Leonid Volkov, he just released smart vote recommendations for Yekaterinburg, and they've changed the strategy a bit. It's no longer as strategic, I guess. It's no longer about picking the sort of second best candidate or the best candidate that could beat the United Russia candidate. It's now anti-war candidates, essentially. And that, to me, suggests that capacity for protest voting has diminished because now essentially the pool of what's considered a protest vote is smaller. It used to be you could vote for anybody but United Russia, and you were in essence you were protesting. But now with the war and with the fact that a lot of the political candidates are now, if not pro-war, then at least sort of neutral on it. And so would you say that the opportunities for protest voting have diminished, or is it something else?
The war itself, as a topic, is the elephant in the room, right? It's been absent from the campaign, as you cannot really talk about the war itself. You can talk about other issues that have to do with the war without mentioning the war. You can talk about inflation. You can talk about social problems. You can talk about veterans and their families, or men who fell in Ukraine and their families and social aid to them. So in such circumstances, it is difficult to determine. It's difficult to speak about anti-war candidates because there are so few of them who are openly anti-war. I see the sort of scope of protest voting, or the chances of protest voting diminished, yes, partly because the authorities have successfully either chased away or jailed people who were organizing, who were doing the really important organizing work on the level of the regions. There's very few information available about the relative strength of candidates in regional elections now, and something that Alexei Navalny's team also noted was that were they to simply name candidates whom they call on their supporters to vote for as a means of protest voting, they would risk that candidate being immediately taken off of the ballot with some kind of excuse, or even jailed in certain cases. And therefore, the kind of protest voting that they have suggested, namely to return to the 2011 method of just voting for any opposition candidate, and in certain regions, like in the Altai region, the Communist Party suggested the same thing. In Novosibirsk, a local opposition alliance suggested the same thing. So I can see this having a significantly smaller effect. It will give some information about how big protest voting is, but it will not lead to people getting elected, or there's a smaller chance that non-United Russia people, or people who would irk the authorities, or who do not have a seat assigned to them as a token opposition deputy, would be elected, as it happened in earlier years, simply because the votes will be more split. So in that sense, yes, the chances of making a huge difference through protest voting in this particular election is diminished.
Protest vote. So voting itself, I don't think it is very much a protest activity. I am now writing an article, and I have very good evidence that shows that protest potential in regions in 2021, so before the war started, protest potential, and this Navalny, so the campaign Free Navalny, and how many people registered to protest during this campaign in early 2021 directly translated into amount of votes that candidates recommended by Navalny's smart voting campaign received. So the higher protest potential, the higher percentage, the higher vote share for candidates recommended by Navalny, which is probably an obvious outcome of 2 years study, but nonetheless, we have a very good mathematical proof with hardcore statistical modeling that this is actually the case. But at the same time, these candidates, they didn't get elected in most cases because authorities used a very sophisticated toolkit of electoral manipulations to change electoral outcomes, to get more votes for incumbents. In Moscow, they introduced this electronic voting. So these different kinds of manipulatory toolkit was applied. So smart voting candidates didn't get elected. So I think protest is not about going and vote. This is a very useful activity. It can be even more useful when a lot of people show up at precincts, and it's going to be harder to manipulate elections if a lot of people show up and cast their ballot sheet. But what is more important is to monitor elections, to participate in other type of activism, and very often election monitoring activism translates in other type of activism. So I think this can be more of a protest activity, even if it is an individual activity under conditions of a severe oppression in autocratic, very, very autocratic Russia now.
Thanks for tuning in, folks. This has been The Naked Pravda, a podcast from Meduza in English. Remember that undesirable status back in Russia means our entire news outlet now relies on readers and listeners around the world to support our work. Please visit our website for information about how to become a contributor with one-time or recurring pledges. Thanks again. Until next week.